Developments tonight in Zimbabwe for you. President Robert Mugabe has dismissed his deputy president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was in line to succeed him, but the arch enemy of the wife of President Robert Mugabe, Grace Mugabe, and concerns now that Emmerson Mnangagwa has support in the army, and that may lead to a standoff. We'll be on that, but also other African news tonight. Over to you, Peter.
Yes, Francis. We go to West Africa now, where Liberia's Supreme Court has halted the presidential runoff amid allegations of irregularities and frauds. And today's judgment comes just a day before the elections were set to take place tomorrow. For more on that story, I'm now joined by Matebe Chisiza, who's from the Southern African Institute of International Affairs. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
All right, so this is quite a significant development. I mean, the first round of elections went off okay, and everybody was optimistic that we're going to have a fair transition of power to whoever won the election. What has gone wrong since then to this point that, you know, we're now questioning whether we can even have an election?
Well, I wouldn't exactly say that anything has gone wrong since then, but it has been a continuation of different events and building up of that. So as you might know, Charles Bramskin from the Liberty Party had actually gone to the Supreme Court the day after the initial elections in October and had mentioned his claims of fraudulence, of voter tampering, as well as ballot boxing and putting different ballots into the different areas that were already filled with voters. So the problem now is the Supreme Court going to take this decision? And it did. And surprisingly, Joseph Boakai of the Unity Party was also backing this appeal and had stated that he's actually against Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in terms of she had met with some NEC politicians, she had met with some NEC representatives the day before the elections. So it has been a different number of elements and activities building up to the moment that we're seeing right now.
Has George Weah responded?
He actually hasn't responded. So the NEC and as well as his own party had described that they will give a formal statement tomorrow. So that is something we can anticipate. But for the most part, I think he's also trying to stay away from this, afraid of tainting his own image, because if you remember, he was leading in these October elections. So majority of the population had thought that in these elections that were supposed to take place tomorrow, George Weah would be the elected president of Liberia.
So are we going to go back to the first election, or are we just debating the issue around the runoff? If you said, you know, just now that there were concerns about irregularities in the first election, does this raise questions even about the first round?
Yes. So in the first round, if you remember, although there wasn't any violence and the international community as well as the regional communities like ECOWAS had credited Liberia for free and fair elections. However, there were claims already of fraudulence going on during that time. So I think that what needs to happen now is those instances need to be addressed. So whatever has been being accused of, whatever Charles Bramskin has been saying that has been going on, these need to be investigated thoroughly. And these were the initial dealings that was supposed to happen even before these elections take place tomorrow. So the Supreme Court decided, yes, in fact, whatever the claims have been true, and there are issues of irregularities that need to be addressed and need to be investigated further. So, yeah.
Could we be, I don't want to use the word crisis lightly, but is this a constitutional crisis that we might be being plunged into?
I wouldn't say, like you mentioned, a constitutional crisis. What I think we're seeing is the courts taking power over electoral bodies. And on the African continent, this is not a normal thing. Unlike Kenya, which we're now seeing surprisingly as well, has taken this on. And perhaps this is a ripple effect that has gone on to Liberia, whereby we're seeing the Supreme Courts taking on a decision against the electoral bodies and stating that actually, in fact, you know what, these elections were not carried out in a free and fair way, despite what was said by the international communities. It's quite surprising that you would even think that ECOWAS and even the UN had said, wow, these were very fantastic elections, despite all the claims behind the scenes.
What are the chances that things could escalate? They've been peaceful so far. Could frustrations start to boil over, as we saw in Kenya, where people are saying, look, you're trying to steal an election from us, and finger pointing. How close are we or how safe are we with the spectre of this thing escalating perhaps to violence?
I think it's pretty close, and this is something that needs to be watched not only by the international community but regional institutions and neighboring countries as well. Because, for example, if we see a situation where in fact the elections do take place and Joseph Boaki wins over George Weah, then there will definitely be some violence, or there will be some clashing between the different parties as well. But what we're seeing right now is also a lot of infighting between the Unity Party, which for 12 years was quite peaceful, and surprisingly Joseph and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and their supporters are almost at a split. So this situation has to be monitored very carefully, and the NEC as well as other electoral bodies that have put in place, and the police as well, have to make sure that they are also encouraging these leaders of oppositions not to encourage their own people to go out into the streets and have a repeat of what we're seeing in Kenya.
Whoever wins,
yes,
are we at a turning point, a moment in time where the politics of Liberia shifts a little bit? There are people saying that Charles Taylor is making a comeback from his jail in this election.
Well, there have been those claims, and if you also know, George Weah's vice presidential running mate is former wife of Charles Taylor. So there are issues of influence if he is in fact influencing the elections from his jail cell in the United Kingdom. However, I don't think that is the situation at the moment. I think that is very far-fetched and quite unfair. I think what we are going to see a different sort of democracy. Unfortunately, the first elected female president will be leaving her seat next year. However, I think we are seeing a more constitutional election that's going to take place, and this is going to drive the democracy of the country moving forward. As you know, or you might not know, that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's party and her government has been curtailed with issues of corruption. So I think the next party coming in or continuing, what needs to happen now is a drastic change from those policies she had implemented when she was re-elected in 2003.
I suppose regional bodies like ECOWAS have to be on top of this. They've been strong in recent times. This is another moment for them.
Definitely. This is going to be a defining moment to not only show their power within the region, but as well as to prove themselves and not to wait for other international organizations to get involved. It would be nice if the AU also could have their people there as well, and monitoring these elections in a more stand-forth and in a more unified stance towards ECOWAS as well.
All right, so we'll wait to see when the new date will be announced for the runoff. But Matebe Chisiza, thank you very much indeed for joining us and sharing your insights with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, so that was Matebe Chisiza from the South African Institute of International Affairs giving us her insights on the situation in Liberia. The presidential second round runoff was meant to happen tomorrow, and the Supreme Court says, no, as we were, we'll inform you of a new date at a later stage.